So virtually, this is going to be a little bit different, but I ask you please bear with me. But we're here today talking about Microsoft Dataverse. Everything, everywhere, here and there. My name is Charles Lakes, and I'll say I largely chose the title Everything, Everywhere, Here and There. Be a little cheeky, but also I believe it kind of encapsulates Dataverse in a number of ways. So first and foremost, I say it's everything because it is going to be the native data solution of the Power Platform. As we jump into the Power Platform and we see what all we can do with the Power Apps, Power BI, and so forth, Dataverse is going to be the native data solution of the entire platform. Then I say it's going to be everywhere because as we start adopting more and more cloud infrastructure, this is also going to be hosted inside of the browser. So as a SQL administrator, you can still use Management Studio if you want to connect to Dataverse, but it's just as accessible in the browser. So you don't have to worry about any installs. Everything is based on cloud infrastructure. So it's browser accessible. It has the cloud infrastructure, which means we have the full support of Azure in the background as well as recovery. So hence everything, everywhere, here and there. As I mentioned, my name is Charles Lakes. A lot of you, this may be your first real encounter with me, so I just keep it very light. It's a very simple introduction. My background is software engineering. So I come into the low-code space from a pro-code background, building desktop applications. I'm working on a few mobile apps. I've done some intranets because my background is SharePoint, so I've done a lot of intranets, as well as just some web design. So I have a pretty storied background doing a lot of just pro-code, nerdy coding as much as I can. And as I mentioned, to my best of my ability, I still try to program whenever I can. However, I often joke that programmers, we aren't the most social creatures. So I actually had someone here out of Atlanta, where I'm based out of, recommended that I start speaking in our local user group and just kind of become better as a community speaker, get better just getting outside my box. And that turned me into blogging because at the time I was transitioning from SharePoint Server to SharePoint Online. If any of you have ever worked with SharePoint, you know there's a lot of levers, a lot of buttons. There's a lot of configuration. SharePoint is a behemoth of an application, and it's matured over this 20-year history. So it turned into me kind of sharing what I was working on with SharePoint and the Power Platform, turned into blogging, sharing the transition, and that turned into an interesting cycle. The more I spoke in the community, the more I got a chance to blog, and the cycle continues. But first and foremost, all that is great as a backstory. Software engineering, community speaker, M365 blogger. But the most important piece here is that I tell people I am a middle child. So if you can, just in the chat, share whether or not you are a middle child or you are an other, and we can jump into the rest of the session as you're chatting. So jumping into our agenda for today, the agenda is going to be largely talking about how you can use Dataverse for 4 different roles. And I see we have several oldest in here and one middle child. So there is some solidarity. So we're going to talk about how Dataverse can help information workers, how it can help the power users, developers, and the admins. So I'm going to talk about it from 4 different perspectives. Although when I look at it from a long story history, I could have filled all these roles as well. But something I enjoy doing that I always do for all my sessions, before I jump into a topic, I like to give a definition so that we're all working under the same understanding of the tool. So I don't want to assume everyone's on the same platform, the same foundational knowledge. So this is the Dataverse definition I got from Wikipedia. And something else I do typically is, although I'm in the Microsoft space, I try my best to not source all my definitions from Microsoft, because some people may look at it as a bias of saying, of course, Microsoft will say, this is like this is how it works. So I like to source definitions from people across the industry to show that these are consistent understandings amongst all the major players. So this comes from Wikipedia, who is actually unbiased here. And from this definition, I believe there's a lot to take out. But the main pieces that I tend to focus on is going to be, first and foremost, Dataverse is going to be a relational database engine. So again, if you're coming from a SQL DBA background, Dataverse welcomes you. It's not going to replace everything you've done inside a SQL Server. A lot of those skills are actually going to be transferable, as well as the developers, myself included. When I build applications, I tend to want to work with a relational database. So it is going to be as we said at the top of the hour, a native data solution for the Power Platform is then going to be a relational database engine. It's not only a database, it's a database engine because it does a lot more than just store your content. Then we also have the fact that Dataverse is built using something called the Common Data Model. What that is essentially Microsoft and a bunch of industry leaders across different industries. They've come up with a schema of what are the most common tables you create when you are building an application. Whether or not you're building an onboarding app, you're building a opportunities or engagement piece for marketing, you may be building something for new hires or even just your own opportunities table. So what are the common tables you need when you're building these applications, as well as what are going to be the most common columns for those? Because a lot of us can create a user table. First name, last name is going to be single line of text, maybe 255 characters. We may scale it down to 75 characters because we don't want to use the entire space of the data column. So essentially, what are the common tables? What are the common field types? And then how are these elements related? And that's what we get the common data model. So instead of as a DBA having to spin up the entire environment and build all your tables, going through all these scripts, when you come into the Power Platform and you say you want to create an environment, you'll get a simple checkbox. Do you or do you not want to create a Dataverse database with this environment to support your applications? And Microsoft provisions Dataverse in 100 plus tables, some of those tables with 100 plus columns with multiple one-to-many, many-to-many, and many-to-one relationships, all out of the box, all out of a few minutes, ready for you to get started without having to build any other scaffolding. So at a high level, that's what Dataverse is. It's going to be the native data solution of the Power Platform that works on the common data model under a relational database engine to get you started to build apps, BI reports, and everything much faster than you would have if you had to build everything from scratch. So now we'll kind of give an overview before I jump into the roles, give you an overview of how you kind of work with Dataverse, just so we have a better picture as well. So if you go to make.powerapps.com, Dataverse, Power Apps, and the entirety of the Power Platform are tightly integrated because Dataverse is essentially the underlying foundation of the Power Platform. So if you come into Power Apps, along the left-hand side, you're going to have an option to look at tables. And sometimes it's not going to be visible if you haven't worked with Dataverse before, but just like you would find your connections and so forth, you can click the three dots at the bottom and you can pin tables to the side. And that's going to make it always visible for you when you're working inside of Power Apps. So make.powerapps.com, you go into tables, and when you get here, where you'll be presented with is going to be a list of recommended tables from Microsoft. So I mentioned there is actually going to be 100 plus tables. We have different tables. And from here, you can see we have the table name, the internal name of a table, as well as type. Standard tables are going to be the ones that are going to be the most common for you to use when you're building your own applications or building anything inside of Dataverse. You will also have a type called activity. This is going to be tracking as you work with things, where the incremental pieces that are tracking, I've done something, I've changed something, I've sent something, your basic CRUD operations, your CRUD, your create, read, update, delete. This is going to be your activity amongst the standard tables. Help you bridge those, very likely going to be your many-to-many tables. But as we see, we have this highlighted for recommended, but we can also look at custom tables, which are going to be any tables we create, as well as all tables. The recommended may only show you 30 or 40, but again, Microsoft and the Common Data Model actually provisions 100 plus tables. So there's a lot for you to look here. My recommendation for people when you're looking into Dataverse is to always come here, toggle to all tables, and just skim through to figure out what the tables are called, what you can use them for, because though this is the Common Data Model, some of the naming convention may be confusing for people. So I have seen people want to rename the tables, but it is also just good practice to get familiar with what Microsoft calls the tables, just to minimize the customizations you have to do for each and every Dataverse environment. So we're going to use the appointment table as a simple example. So you come into the appointment table. This is where the administrators may feel more comfortable. You see that we have a section to look at the schemas. We have data experiences, customizations, but something that's also kind of powerful here inside of Dataverse. Dataverse is, as the name implies, is going to be heavily data driven. There's actually a feature along the top of the navigation here to say create an app. This is probably going to be the fastest you can create a solution. That's going to be what we call a model driven app. So if you have experience with Power Apps and you've done a Canvas app where you're able to kind of tweak the UI, the model driven apps are going to be strictly data driven. I have a table. My table is called appointment. I have columns subject. We have regarding, location, and you see there's at least 50 plus more additional columns. So what Dataverse is going to do is take the context of all the columns, context of the table, and if I select create an app, I'm going to be prompted with the ability of creating a very simple app based off the appointment table with no customization, no real development needed, all out the box for Dataverse. And you see that it's going to create everything that we will need to get started. We're going to have features for sorting, filtering, and search, as well as the editing options. So this feels very similar to if you've been around since the Microsoft Access days. Access was not a production enterprise level database. It was meant for personal productivity. But we've seen people build Access databases to support enterprise level solutions. We've seen people do the same with Microsoft Excel. Excel is not a database, but people have created lookup S columns inside of Microsoft Excel. The same with SharePoint. So whether or not it's Microsoft Access, it's Microsoft Excel, or even SharePoint Server or SharePoint Online, people have used lists, libraries, and so forth to create relationships because they want the native sorting, filtering, and searching ability. But Dataverse gives you that out the box when you create a model-driven app with edit forms. So just like with SharePoint, you get the new edit and display forms. You get all that from the simple click of create an app using this table. And you can do that with any of the tables. If you want to create relationships, those relationships are also present in the table as well. So you don't have to create the app and then connect the relationships. It's context aware that, hey, this table appointment is tied to the user table. So when I say I have a new appointment, it's going to look at the relationship for the user table and include that in the app as well. And as you make new connections, new relationships, you can always create additional apps as well. But we've talked about a lot with the common data model being pretty much everything out the box. But again, everything out the box is going to be the common columns, the common tables. We're still going to have options where we may want to have a solution that is a little bit more nuanced. So if we need to, we can always come into an existing table and create new columns, new relationships, and new keys and so forth. If we choose to create a new column, this is going to be very reminiscent of SharePoint as well as Microsoft Access. We can choose whether or not it's a text field, number field, date, and for each of these, we get a deeper dive in as well. We have text, we actually choose whether or not it's a single line of text, multi-line. You can specify whether or not it's going to support email, phone number. So you have some of that regex built into it to give you some validity for those text fields. Same with a number. Is this going to be an integer, a decimal, a float, and so forth. So you can get granular if need be. Same with date and time. Is it going to be date and time, just the date, and so forth. So you have a lot of flexibility to create new columns on top of the model that Microsoft has provisioned with the common data model. You also have the ability of creating new relationships. So if you create a new column or a new table that you want this to be your new primary key, you can set up your many to one relationships. You can set up your many to many as well as your one to many relationships. So with Dataverse, you're able to kind of get all that out the box. Moving on for here, you have also being able to create new tables. And nothing in Power Platform right now is complete without Copilot being available. So you see we have an option to get started with Copilot. We can actually describe what we're trying to build. We're trying to build a hotel app to track users checking into our hotel. And we can provide that as a prompt to Copilot. And Copilot will actually suggest how to build the tables. What should be the relationships? What should be the columns? What should be the column types? And ask you if this is okay. You can always give feedback to Copilot as well. Hey, this relationship doesn't work with me. I would like to change the data a little bit this way. And you can do all that with Copilot. If you're like me and you prefer to go the old fashioned way and you want to create a table from scratch, you can. We also have an option creating a table from an existing Excel file or CSV, as well as from SharePoint lists. SharePoint list, though, is still in public preview, I believe. It should be getting out of preview at some point, but you have all these options of creating tables with Copilot, existing files, SharePoint lists, or creating from scratch. And if you're wanting to create from scratch, because you may have had data in another system, because Dataverse is great, I believe personally, for all large organizations. But the problem with a large organization is that we have data from 10, 15, 30 years that we've been storing in other systems. If we wanted to bring that content into Dataverse, we do have a way, which if you have not become very familiar with Power Query, Power Query is a feature that is native to Microsoft Excel. If you go into Microsoft Excel and you import a CSV into Excel, you are using Power Query, and that's available here as well. And you see there's a bunch of data sources, and this is not all of them. There are a lot of data sources available inside of Dataverse to bring the content inside of a Dataverse table. A few standouts that I think are the most important is, again, we have people using Microsoft Excel and Access as a database. You can pull those tables and files into Dataverse and structure them better than they would be in an existing system. You have the tried and true text files and CSV. A lot of people were actually surprised to find out you can actually import data with Power Query from PDF files. And that has been something that if you want to surprise and win over your business leaders, they have a lot of PDFs. Depending on your industry, I work with a lot of people that are in commercial real estate. There are a lot of tables in those PDFs. We can point to the PDF, pull the data from the tables into Dataverse as well using Power Query. You also have the ability to pull content from other Dataverse environments. A good nuance to acknowledge here is when you create an environment, there is one Dataverse database per environment. You can have multiple tables. You can create new tables, but there's one Dataverse database per Power Platform environment. So this can actually import content from other databases from other environments if you connect them. You can also connect these to Salesforce, Amazon Redshift. Data flows are actually going to be a process where you can actually have a scheduled import, very reminiscent of a Power BI refresh of a data source. Instead of refreshing the data source for a visual, you can actually tell Power BI, Dataverse and its data flows, I'm wanting to import content from this external resource, and I want to pull it back on a particular cadence. That cadence could be once a day, every few hours, once a week. Whatever the cadence can be, you can set up a data flow to pull content into Dataverse to store it because you may want it more local to your Power Platform environments. You also have SharePoint lists, as we talked about, which is in preview. So there's a lot here. And the last thing I would mention for the standouts is JSON files. A lot of people see JSON files to get intimidated. You don't have to transform the JSON to something more readable for the human eye. You can actually take the JSON and actually import it directly into the table as well. So there are a bunch of options of being able to pull the data using Power Query. And again, these aren't the only options. It's a bigger scroll for a few more options here. And as the cloud infrastructure grows, because again, we're inside the cloud architecture now, there will likely be new connectors here. You may have noticed that even a moment ago, there's a connector for Microsoft Fabric. Fabric is growing in popularity. There's a lot more people speaking on Fabric. You can pull content from Fabric into Dataverse. One caveat to notice there is that if you pull all your data into Dataverse and you're not ready to really embrace Dataverse, you may worry about not having the decode and copy because you're not duplicating data between systems. There is a object type inside of Dataverse called a virtual table. You can actually just import your content into the virtual table, and the virtual table will just be a representation of your data within Dataverse, but it allows you to perform your CRUD operations. So it will do the CRUD operations on your virtual table and make sure those are pushed to where your data is actually stored. whether or not it's SQL Server or so forth. And that is largely going to be the high level overview of Dataverse. It's kind of moving around Power Platform and Power Apps. With all of that, before we jump into the fun and games, are there any questions in the chat or anyone would like to come off mute to ask a question before I dive into the particular roles? I see some typing. All right, so the question is there additional cost for Power Query with some of these data sources like PDF? So for PDF, no. If you're working with PDF like you would a CSV or a text file, there's not going to be any additional costs. There will be additional costs if you're tying into a premium service. Something like Salesforce is going to have a license to use Salesforce. Not just the license inside the Salesforce, but there is a premium connector to connect to those premium solutions. So there will be a cost for the premium content, but PDF is out of the box. You can connect to Microsoft Excel and import from Excel into import the PDF into Excel, Power BI, and Dataverse for no additional cost today. And yeah, that's a fun fact. What is the difference between Fabric and Dataverse? So I am not the most educated on Fabric. I will say a high level, what I understand, Fabric seems to be more of a data lake, which is going to be a collection of all different data types, which may not all be relational. And it sits ultimately underneath and supports Dataverse. So Dataverse becomes the relational piece of it, of structuring the data inside of a table, which you have data lake, which I believe, again, Fabric is going to be a data lake, is just supporting Dataverse. So it may not be the best answer, but that's my understanding of Fabric. All right, so I hope that helps. When you're using the Dataverse connector, is there a way to sync production data to sandbox environment that would be able to override data, or does it know the changes since the last transfer? So when you do your data flow, you do have configurations for it. It gets kind of tricky, or not too tricky, but it's just a nuance that may trick some people up. When you're saying, I would like to sync this data from this external source into here, whether that's your production database or just another system, there is going to be a delta of the content. And you can specify whether or not it should import everything and allow duplicates, or if you have a primary key, you can specify what the key should be and make sure that this becomes your golden source. So only pull over the changes. So it is possible to sync content from production to a sandbox or production to another environment and specify to bring over just the delta and not everything. And thank you all for the questions. All right, so now we'll talk about some of the fun parts. So as I mentioned in my intro, I started my background as a software engineer. I started transitioning into more admin roles, more architecture. And so one of the things that is helpful of Dataverse being so tightly integrated as the foundation of the Power Platform, there's a lot as an admin we can do to secure and protect the environment. Because one of the things we hear a lot is people are excited about the idea of power users building things inside the Power Platform, but they worry about putting proper guardrails. As admins, this gives us a lot of power of what we can do to have guardrails. And as we move through the other personas, we'll see how those guardrails are able to kind of protect everything as well as protect ourselves as well, because we don't want to get caught flat-footed. And I mentioned this a little bit at the very beginning, but when you're coming into the Power Platform and you're wanting to build everything, you're building everything inside of an environment. By default, if you're licensed for the Power Platform, you get a default environment for your org, whatever your org's name is. So I have I have a tenant for the Two Lakes group. So then I will have the Two Lakes group default. You may have, we see the tried and true Contoso will have a Contoso default. So you have a default environment where everyone has access. Unfortunately, you can't block people from having access to the default environment unless you just take away their licensing for the Power Platform. However, if you start getting them into their own environments, you can spin up new developer environments, new production environments. And production only means that it's going to be licensed as something that you're building. You're not just playing around. If you're doing the trial developer sandbox, those are going to be environments that Microsoft, if they were to audit the environments, we're not saying that they're going to be auditing every environment every day, but if they were to take a look at your environments, they would assume those are going to be your dev environments, your UAT. These are places that you're testing that could be thrown away and not hurt your day to day. If you're doing anything that relies on stability, we do recommend you do a production environment. But the cool thing about when you have these environments is that by default, not everyone has access to those environments. You can actually spin up security groups inside of Entra ID, make sure those groups are applied to give access to the environments, and then only the people who are part of those groups have access to your environments. So that works as a layer of security, because if you want to set up an environment for HR, an environment for legal, and then let's say an environment for marketing, you can specify that they only have access to their respective environments. So there's no cross-pollination and there's no accidental data leakage, because we know HR has very sensitive information that no one should see outside of HR. Same with legal. And you can make sure that those environments are permissioned using Entra Security ID security groups, and that they are only going to be accessible or even seen by those respective people. And then once you protect the environments, you can also do some auditing. There's some default auditing that's baked out the box. A lot of times it will be turned off for the environments, but as an admin, you can go into the Power Platform Admin Center. The logs are stored inside the Dataverse. So there is the, I guess, small word of caution that if you are working with an environment that there's a lot of activity, your logs may get pretty large. So there's a concern of not having retained logs forever. You have the ability of saying, we may want to preserve logs for 90 days, 180 days, something that allows you to come into, yes, Sharon, trim your logs. Trim your logs, because one of my personal projects I'm evangelizing is trying to get people to delete content that's no longer necessary. So we know that data largely has storage has gotten cheap over the years. So people want to keep everything as long as possible, but there comes a point where they have to realize that, is it necessary or is this a want? And when we're working with org data or systems, where possible, we should be leaning more towards the necessity, not the want. So if you have a lot of logs, trim them. Don't keep them from error. I think a good case is maybe 180 days, or you can go up to a year. That way, if something were to go wrong, you can always figure out which accounts did what by looking at the audit logs. That admins are able to do, and this is actually going to scroll to just show you how many roles are available. I think this kind of does a mixture of what we do for roles inside a SQL Server, as well as some of the security roles inside of SharePoint, of how we're able to specify, yes, we're giving you access to this environment, we're giving you access to this data, but then you have the ability of choosing who has access to the environment, as well as what they're allowed to do within the environment. You can technically give everyone access to the environment for the organization, all 1,000 people as a basic user, but you may have only 5 people you want to elevate to a higher level, allowing them to do more inside the environment. This is what the security roles are. You're able to specify who do what outside of basic roles, whether or not it's auditing, approval. You can set up teams within Microsoft Dataverse, controlling who can and cannot see certain tables, which is actually a nice security role feature here, is that if there's a concern that, hey, I'm giving everyone access to the environment and they can see all the tables, you can actually specify which tables certain people are able to see or unable to see, as well as apply with security roles, column level and row level security. Column level security, a good example of that may be you have a user table and you may have sensitive information such as a social security number. You can specify a column level security to hide the social security number for anyone who's not privy to being inside that security group. Same with row level security, you may have deals. So if you have a bunch of originators having different deals, you can see deals that you can create, but not deals created by your colleagues. So those are examples of why you may want to employ column level and row level security. That we get to benefit from as an admin when we're setting up Dataverse is actually specifying where our data is going to be located. And so there are geo regions set up around the world where by default here in the States, we may default to the States of creating something either East Coast or West Coast. But if you have a organization that supports people around the world, you may want to specify a geo region closer to them because I don't imagine the latency being too big. But if you're having a lot of solutions, a lot of apps, and they're constantly querying data, and we have, let's say, a sizable workforce in Australia, we can actually set up a Dataverse environment to be closer inside using the geo region inside of Australia. That way, they don't have the latency of going from Australia to the US and back to return data. And I see there's a question in the chat. Do you have a good tool to draw out security roles and business units, teams to create the security that you need prior to using the database? A good tool. I would say, I don't know if I say if it's a good tool, something I find that's helpful for a lot of people that I actually highlight a little bit in a bit is going to be the XRM toolbox. That is a good tool that people use when you have Dataverse. A lot of stuff is out of the box. It's very vanilla, but you're able to use the XRM toolbox to do a lot of customization, whether or not it's troubleshooting user access or so forth. So I'll try to see if I can highlight it a bit more if that doesn't already answer the question.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I work for the government, and so I don't have access for the XRM toolbox on our environments. And so, yeah, I was essentially asking because I have like 3 different business units and teams and trying to figure out the security rules. And I have to use Microsoft user groups to add people that are then associated with those security rules to the database data.
Okay.
And so I think I might have duplication that might not necessarily be necessary if I define the security rules better, but I have a hard time finding information that really goes into how security roles, business units, and teams work together.
Okay. I know there's a few articles on Microsoft Learn that I had open actually a few days ago that I was reading on. If you ping me outside of this, I can see if I can find the article I was looking at, and that may be helpful.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Very welcome. All right, jumping into it. So once we get past the geo regions, which is a great tool for the admins of being able to, one, put the data local to where your audience may be. It may also be a legal requirement. To Rhonda's question, working for the government, there may be a reason why, for government reasons, you cannot have data stored outside the US. So you can actually specify all your geo regions are just going to be US, either East Coast or West Coast. There's nothing in the UK, nothing in Australia, nothing in China, because you have to be in the US. So that's another good reason to consider setting up your geo regions. Here, another thing that as admins we can kind of put some guardrails on is going to be DLP. It's confusing to call this DLP because it's not the same DLP as we would do inside of SharePoint. Here is going to be data loss prevention, where we have the connectors inside the Power Platform. If you work with Power Apps or if you work with Power Automate, you're very familiar with using connectors to connect to a system like Microsoft Excel, SharePoint, Salesforce, SurveyMonkey, whatever the system may be, working with those connectors. You can actually come into the Power Platform Admin Center. And again, this is all part of Dataverse and Power Platform as the admin piece. You can choose which connectors are categorized as business, non-business, and blocked. If the connector is blocked, those they cannot be used anywhere. They will actually be able to add them to a flow, but then they'll be notified that they can't sign in and use it because it goes against a policy set across for the organization. And this is great because if you're worried about exfiltration, let's say someone's doing something suspicious, we are using Dynamics to do our ERP system. We're not doing Salesforce, but you found a rogue unit of your organization using Salesforce. You can actually say, hey, we understand why you're using Salesforce. We'll allow you to use Salesforce, but Salesforce and Dynamics can't be used in the same connector because you may be worried about them copying data outside of Dynamics into Salesforce and creating redundancy. So you have flexibility with DLP policies of either considering it business, non-business, blocking the connector altogether, or simply just blocking connectors from being used together. So there's a few different ways there. And we also have the Center of Excellence. I highly recommend it. I do believe there's a version of the Center of Excellence also for government, but essentially this is a way for the admins to be able to get a snapshot picture at a high level of what does the environment look like. Who's creating the most flows, who's creating the most apps, whose flows are running the most, and so forth, kind of connectors. And you're able to kind of get that in the Center of Excellence, which is an open source piece in collaboration with Microsoft, I believe. So this is great for getting a snapshot of your environment. And that gives us what we're able to do as an admin. And I tackle the role this way because at the admin level, we've now set the parameters. We set up so many guardrails. We chose which connectors they can use. We set up the environments. We set up where the environments are located. And so we set up a lot of guardrails. And now for our developers, we can control what they can and cannot do, giving them plenty of freedom, such as working with the data models. Because now that they're using the common data model, we don't have to worry about what the tables are called because the tables are always going to have a consistent naming convention. Same with the columns. We know what the relationships are because as we spin up more and more Dataverse databases, they now have a consistency as they're building their apps. And that's something as a developer I wish I had back in the day because what I will call a table may differ than my colleagues would call a table. Our column's going to be very different. I actually just worked on a project recently where I was connecting two systems. The column names were very different. The column orderings was very different. The constraints on the columns was very different. So now I'm forced to put a lot of extra error handling in the system to accommodate if there's a problem because I'm saying the column should only be, let's say 60 characters, but they allowed it up to 75 characters. So there's a lot of inconsistency, but having a common data model, our apps, our automations, our virtual agents, our bots now have a consistent data source to work with. Additionally, we're able to work with the developers of creating business rules on that common data model. We can have processes that are built that say, if you're submitting an invoice, as long as your invoice is under, let's say $500, it's automatically approved. But once it's $501, it needs to route for approval. And that's a very simple business process rule you can set in place that we oftentimes have a lot of processes that we're having to memorize. When I do this, who's the next person? This becomes fully automated as you're building your apps inside of Dataverse. So you're having these business rules that are going to be, once you set them in place, they're off to the races. But the fun part here is, again, this is what we're talking about, the XRM toolbox. Unfortunately, I know, Rhonda, you mentioned you don't have access to the toolbox. Maybe they'll grant you access at some point. We're crossing our fingers that you can get access to the toolbox. The toolbox is a great way of being able to do a lot of extensibility on Dataverse. When you look at Dataverse, again, it's not simply a database. It's a full database engine on a platform that is fully extensible. And you can actually create components on top of Dataverse to customize your tables, customize the business logic. You can put some JavaScript in here, but there's an open source tool, XRM toolbox that other people are building. You can always donate to, whether it's monetarily or your time, but it's available to help us all. And this works with Dataverse as well as Dynamics. So as a developer, we can still do a lot here. Then as we're doing all our development, because we like to build everything, developers, we like to build as much as we can still adopt application lifecycle management. The short here is that if you're taking my code from dev, I should push it at some point to what we call user acceptance testing. That's going to be our testers give me the Caesar thumbs up or thumbs down. Does this break anything? Is this okay to move to production? Because the last thing I want to do is take production down. So I can actually move my code from dev in Dataverse to the next environment, which is going to be my testing. If it gets a thumbs up, I then move it to another environment, potentially to UAT, before it goes to production. And the reason why this is important with Dataverse is you can actually create a pipeline. If you do this manually, you have to export it to a zip, hand it to someone to actually move it to the next environment, and so forth. But if you use Dataverse, you can actually set up a pipeline where the entire process of deploying from dev to UAT to production is automated. So it's another saving grace for our developers. And an honorable mention, I would say, is AppSource. As developers, we tend to want to build as much as we can, but as we get more and more to the Power Platform, we realize we don't have to build as much anymore. So AppSource is actually an open marketplace of other people who have built solutions using the Power Platform and Dataverse as a backend. And you can actually download solutions to your environment from AppSource. So it's a good place of, before you build, did Microsoft build it inside the Power Platform at Dynamics? If Microsoft didn't build it, do you have a partner that has built something in here? And then you can decide if you want to build it or customize on top of something. So you have a lot of flexibility before you crank out the wrench and the screwdriver to build something from scratch. And as I'm getting ready to jump into the power users, again, if you have any kind of questions, you can always just come off mute or you can write it in the chat. So we've talked about this now from high level. We have the administrators have set a lot of guardrails in place of what developers can do. Then the developers are able to then create solutions for our power users, or the power users can come in and decide they want to build something of their own as well. Because Dataverse is great as a database engine, it supports the entire Power Platform. So Power Apps, we have two versions of Power Apps. We had the model-driven app we were able to create using Dataverse natively, but you can also create Canvas apps using Dataverse as a source as well. And if you're doing things with side of Canvas apps, you very likely want to trigger things to happen when you press a button, open the screen, if you submit a record, and that's when Power Automate comes in. And this shows you just how native Dataverse is with Power Automate. This is going to be a list of all the actions available just right now inside of Power Automate. So we can get things by ID, we can get things by rows from a particular environment. I think there was a question earlier about if we wanted to do a data flow from environment to environment. If there's not a native way of using a data flow to connect from environment to environment, you can also use Power Automate as well. I've seen people use Power Automate to connect to an external system, and then just on a schedule, they can pull the data into Dataverse, or they can take it the other way around. They may have a bunch of records that need to provide a report on. They can use the available actions for Power Automate to just query the records that are necessary and provide them to the necessary party using Power Automate as well. And the question in the chat is, using the multiple environments, dev, test, prod, do you need each environment to have its own Dataverse instance? Does that cost per environment? I assume the columns flow with the migration, but does that data go with it? I typically use SharePoint, which requires completely separate lists, but that's not a great option. So Jonathan, thank you for the question. And you're right. So SharePoint, I'm guilty of this as well, is not a great solution here. Partly because SharePoint isn't a native database. But if you're dealing with a lot of data inside of SharePoint, you're going to very quickly run into delegation issues. And that's what I came across a while ago, where SharePoint is great once the content is structured. But if you're trying to query where starts with, ends with, contains, those type of wildcards, SharePoint starts falling apart once you pass the 5,000 item threshold, which is native for the databases. It's good for solid match. Is this or is this not equal to? But once you start doing wildcards above 5,000, it gets very tricky with the Power Platform because of delegation. Delegation is much better inside of Dataverse. And for anyone unfamiliar with delegation, the Power Platform is great. It does good with a lot of heavy lifting, but it's not meant to replace all your huge processing multi-million records a second type work. So delegation is it's saying, hey, I can do my share, but I would like to be able to pass off the heavier processing to someone else. So if you're working without a SQL Server, it will pass on the queries to SQL Server, let SQL Server do all the heavy processing, and then just return the result. If you try to do that with SharePoint, SharePoint kind of falls apart because the wildcard searches aren't as powerful. So that's why SharePoint, to your point, is not a good solution. If you wanted to migrate between dev, test, and prod, you will need a database for Dataverse for each instance. I will say there is a cost, but if you're not if you're not sure what your foot traffic is going to be for those environments, there is a pay-as-you-go model available within the Power Platform where you don't have to license each person individually. You can do pay-as-you-go and see how much traffic you get before you turn on the full licensing. But there is a cost to Dataverse. The piece that might be a saving grace is if you're already spending costs inside a SQL Server or another system like Salesforce or Snowflake, for whatever reason, you may be able to offset the cost if you're able to wind down some of those systems and make Dataverse your golden record. So you will need a Dataverse database for each environment, and there will be a cost. But we know the way data works, there's a cost for all data. And hopefully that helps answer the question. And jumping back to, I assume that's a thumbs up, thank you. Jumping back into it. So we have Power Apps. Again, we have Canvas and model-driven apps. Power Automate is able to do a lot of actions of being able to move content, address content. And then Power BI, a lot of us, though Power BI is not really officially a part of the Power Platform anymore, is more of a fabric tool, there's still native connectivity inside of Power BI to Dataverse. So just as you would connect to SharePoint, SQL Server, a native folder, you can connect to Dataverse inside of Power BI as well and build richer databases. Data visualizations. Something to keep in mind, especially as we talk about Power Apps and Power Automate, when we talk about Dataverse being native, it's native because you don't need an API call to call Dataverse, so you get to save some resourcing. So that's what we mean also when we say it's native to Power Apps and Power Automate. It does not necessitate an API call like you would in an external system. So it may only be microseconds, but you save some latency because there's no API call. You got Power Pages, which is going to be the low-code way of building websites. Power Pages sits directly on top of Dataverse. So if you're authenticating your external users, they can have authentication with their content stored inside Dataverse, which is native to Power Pages. At the top of the call, Sharon and I were talking about Copilot Studio. You can connect a lot of data sources to Copilot Studio as you're building agents. And Dataverse is just another one of those data sources inside of your toolbox where you're able to do a lot. If you're connecting to SharePoint, I talked to a colleague of mine who was building an agent with SharePoint. It worked to an extent, but he got the better performance once he connected his Copilot Studio agent to Dataverse. So Dataverse works better than SharePoint and some other data sources as well, where you're building an agent here. And another honorable mention, there's actually two versions of Dataverse, which can be kind of confusing. There's Dataverse, which is going to be the full license version for the Power Platform, but then there's a free version that's, I guess, asterisk free inside of Microsoft Teams. So if you go into Microsoft Teams and you decide to add an app, you add a Power App, you can connect your apps to a team and build apps directly within your team space. The caveat here for people to keep in mind is not a full, yes, asterisk free. It's not going to be the full version of Dataverse. So Dataverse can store terabytes of content. I don't remember which large organization, but by default, you start getting 2 gigabytes. You can buy more storage and more storage and more storage. There's someone out there with terabytes of storage inside of Dataverse because that's how much they've started building inside the Power Platform. If you build Dataverse using Microsoft Teams, by default, it's only constrained to your team. You have a cap of 2 gigabytes and you can only store 2 million records. If you want to go above the 2 gigabyte storage allocation or the 2 million records, you will have to work with your admin. And there is a process in place that Microsoft helps you when you're going to take that from your team space into its full Dataverse environment. So that is the caveat of Microsoft Teams. There's an asterisk of free, but it's going to be limited to 2 million records and a storage allocation of 2 gigabytes for storage. And now as we kind of wind down, we keep going down the tree. So you have the admins have set so many guardrails in place. The developers are able to set up a lot of systems in place, and then the power users are able to do a lot. So by the time we get to the information workers, they don't really care about the infrastructure. All we know is, are they or are they not licensed inside of Entra ID? Because once they're licensed, and we talked about the security groups, give them access to an environment, we make sure they have access to the app or the resources or their respective tables. For them, it just works. And for a lot of information workers, that's all they care about. They don't care how you made it work. They just care that it works. So once they're licensed, it flows automatically depending on how you set up security models, whether or not it's a team inside a Dataverse that's feeding from an Entra group, or there's just a general group that gives them access to everything in the environment, or specifying which environments. All they know is that it works. Also, one of my personal benefits that I think the information workers would like is that it's a browser UI. There are a lot of times historically that IT we've had to troubleshoot. Do you have this version of this application installed? Is it running? Like, we'll use the OneDrive Sync client as an example. If someone is having issues with the OneDrive Sync, did they get the recent updates for the sync? Which version are they using? Have they restarted the computer lately? So there's a lot of troubleshooting steps that we have to go through to figure out where are they out of alignment with the rest of the organization, and then figure out where we can fix it. If we're in the browser, a change is made, you refresh the browser window, they're up and running. So again, with Entra, the license, it just works. Browser UI, it just works. If I had to reorder a column, if I had to create a new view, if I had to create a new form, once they refresh their browser, there's no install, there's no updating, there's no resetting of their computer. They're resetting the browser. And if we want to be really saucy, we could say try a different browser. It just works once they're in the browser UI. And the last part for them is it's familiar. So being inside the Microsoft space, a lot of your users at some point have worked with a form they've created inside of Access. They may have, shuttering a little bit, they may have worked with VBA inside of Microsoft Excel and created their own custom forms as well. They may have created a bunch of forms inside of SharePoint. So there's a lot of experiences that they have worked with other Microsoft products using forms, views, and charts that is going to be native inside of Dataverse just out the box. They're not having to create anything. They can choose these forms, they can reorder the columns, and it feels very reminiscent of all the tools they've been working with for the past 5-10 years. Because we realized that a lot of users, this is nothing against them, because their job is to be able to make the donuts. So they don't really care about the infrastructure of the technology. They just want it to work. And so when something's familiar, they don't want to make a drastic change. So creating the forms and the views and the charts and the dashboards looks very familiar with other systems, and it allows them to kind of keep their work done with minimum interference. So just a quick recap as we come to a close and open it up for what we have for questions. For the information workers, it just works. They are in an environment that's very familiar to them. They're able to do what they need to do. The power users are able to build a lot with the Power Platform, and the developers are able to do a lot with XRM Toolbox. They can customize things as well. You have the app source. If they don't want to build it yet, they can see what's available. And all that is maintained because the administrators have created very powerful guardrails. We've specified the region. We've specified which connectors can be used. We've set up the different environments. We have Entra security groups controlling who can and cannot do certain things. We have column level security, row level security. We've been able to set up the groups to choose which tables they can use as well. And with those guardrails in place, the big concern is, again, for someone going rogue, it's hard for them to go rogue, hard for them to break anything. It's hard for them to surface anything they should not have or be able to log into a system, because from the top down, we've created a lot of guardrails in place, protecting them, protecting the data, ultimately protecting the organization using Dataverse, which is going to be our native data solution for the Power Platform. And I'll leave this up if anyone wants to contact me. I believe, Rhonda, you had a question. We're trying to see if we can find out some information on a few things. So this is my contact information. And for the one other middle child that was in the chat here, we have our crowns. And thank you, everybody, for listening.